Right, good morning, everybody. This is a bit of a strange one. This is the Blueprint podcast brought to you by Conservative Home. For anybody that doesn't know, this is a recent podcast that I set up, and the team at Con Home have been absolutely incredible in partnering with us. So this is now being live streamed on the Conservative Home platform, so you can watch this back on the website, on their YouTube channel, and over the coming weeks it will also be up on the new Blueprint podcast website. And so after the event, this will also be uploaded to all of the normal podcast streaming platforms, so you can listen back at your leisure. And we've had three of the leadership contenders on the podcast so far. Really interesting discussions with them all. They've all got very different things to offer, so if you're still considering who to support in the leadership election, do go and give it a listen. We've got the fourth coming on very shortly. The last episode was Ruth Davison, gave some really interesting insights to what it is to be a Conservative, and gave her incredible perspective on the success she had in Scotland and how we might be able to learn from that with the future of the Conservative Party in opposition. But today we have Andy Street, and many of you will know Andy Street as the former mayor of the West Midlands, extremely important, influential figure within the Conservative Party, increasingly so even after the West Midlands mayoral election, and former Chief Executive of John Lewis. So thank you, Andy, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it, I think.
So before we jump into it, we're here at live streaming this, recording this at Tory Conference. Give us your impression of what the conference has been like in Birmingham so far.
Well, of course, we love hosting it in Birmingham. That's the most important word in that sentence, the city's name, because it's great to actually show off what's going on in the city. And hopefully, to our guests, we've made you very welcome. And you go away, as I said on my speech on Sunday afternoon, with some sort of notion which goes something like, it's better than we expected it to be. And as proud Brummies, we're allowed to say that. So there we are. But that's been good. But more important answer to your question. Everyone said, oh, the conference will be downbeat, it'll be awake. But actually, the fact that the leadership contenders, and you do have to spare a thought for them, don't you, put through this sort of 4-day trial, a never-ending trial, it's actually given the conference real purpose and energy. And so actually, it's been, I think, a positive effect.
Well, I think it's really interesting. All of the media that I've spoken to during the conference have said the same thing. They've been surprised as to how positive and energetic it's been. I think partly that's because of how downbeat and dour the Labour Party was last week at their conference. But I also think it'd be interesting to get your views on this. When people say that this conference has been positive and energetic, I kind of say, well, there's a subtle difference in everybody kind of pretending that the defeat didn't happen. I actually think members, including in this room but across the conference, are more energised about the fact that they have a voice in the reset of the Conservative Party over recent years. It's more the energy of the leadership contest rather than us pretending as if the defeat didn't happen.
That's correct. So no one's pretending the defeat didn't happen. And actually, I think almost the enormity of the defeat leads people, and this is true in lots of things in life when you get big setbacks, isn't it? You actually have to dig really deep and think about what are we going to do now? And that thinking about the future actually is where the energy then comes from. And if we're really honest, 12 months ago, it was difficult for members to be really energised because the sort of writing was on the wall, if we're very honest. But now, not that we would wish to be in this position, but there is some liberation from the position, actually, and you can actually think, let's plan differently for the future.
Well, let's jump into that. We might as well. I'm going to move this my proposed questions around, given that you've brought it up. What was your analysis of the general election loss? I mean, I think everybody kind of broadly agrees, but it'd be interesting to get your views on why did we lose the election, what actually went wrong, and like you say, you saw it coming a year ago or so. What was your analysis?
So I think it's all very well to examine the sort of months that led up to the general election, but I hate to say it, I think you've got to examine the years that led to it, actually. And there were only 2 real step changes in public opinion in the 5 years up to it. And the first one, sadly, was Partygate, and then that coinciding with the whole Owen Paterson stuff, and there was a big step down. And then, of course, Boris never recovered from that. And the second one, the big step down in the trust in the Conservative Party, was Liz Truss's failed budget. And it was almost as though whatever happened after that, the trust could not be restored. And I've used that word twice deliberately, trust, because that's ultimately what it was. People just did not believe in us as individuals, and they certainly didn't believe that we had the collective ability to address the significant problems facing the country. So it was that erosion of trust.
So I've been saying to people, because obviously Rishi Sunak, depending on who you speak to, but a lot of people, blame Rishi for particularly the election campaign, the calling of the election, how it was run. But my evaluation of it is, particularly with the reference to Liz Truss, I don't think it mattered who our leader was post Liz Truss, whether it was Rishi Sunak or somebody else. It kind of felt to me, particularly looking back, that we could have had a different leader with the best manifesto, with the greatest campaign that we've ever seen in this country, and we would have still lost that election. Do you agree with that, or would you think there was a way through it post Liz Truss to be able to still win the election?
Basically, I agree with you, Ben, yes, but I don't think then it would be right just to say, and certain MPs lost very marginally, probably we lost more seats than we had to. Could we have won? Probably not, but it's not right just to say everything was preordained 2 years before. The underlying trust point was, but there were definitely errors that were made after that as well.
So what happened then in that time period that meant that the defeat was as bad as it was? Do you think that Rishi has a lot of blame to take?
I'm not going to personalise it. You know, when I lost, people said put it all on Rishi Sunak's shoulders. That's not my way of doing things. But I do believe the timing was wrong. So the thing I think that perhaps is worthy of consideration, because this actually takes us to something going forward as well. What I genuinely thought would happen was that we would do a better job at unpicking the Labour proposition. And I think lots of journalists expected that to happen as well. And lots of people said it'll get better because we'll do that. And we didn't manage to do that. And so that, I think, actually accentuated the scale of loss.
But do you also, and I agree, I think the campaign could have been much, much better. But at the same time, were you not as frustrated as I was that the media didn't really seem to be evaluating or giving any sort of real critique of the Labour
I was.
campaign itself?
Of course. And then, definitely that's true. But then you actually keep going back. So we kept giving them distractions, unforced errors that they were able to deal with. And we were not consistent enough ourselves in attacking that. And therefore, we didn't, in a sense, force the media to that. But they did get something of a free pass. That is true.
Yeah, and I think arguably they're still getting a little bit of a free pass, albeit the freebies and all of the scandals that are coming out are certainly having an impact. So I suppose we don't want to be too hung up on the general election. I think it's pretty well trodden, and I think broadly speaking, people know why it went wrong. And I don't see huge divergence at Conservative Party conference that people are saying very different things about the diagnosis of what actually happened. But now we are where we are. We have 4 leadership contenders who have been at conference, obviously running around from one event to another and trying to, press the flesh and please people and try and get their votes ahead of the members' vote that will happen in October with the announcement on the 2nd of November. One of the things that I've found is that all of the leadership contenders are saying very similar things around, and you've touched upon a couple of them, Andy. So trust, competence, loss of confidence from the public. I think the Labour Party did extremely well in tapping into that feeling that the country wasn't working anymore, which kind of tapped into that trust and competence issue. Obviously, unity of the party that we've seen disintegrate over recent years and all of the scandals that ensued and the resignations, etc. So everybody's saying that. But what I'm not hearing much of, and tell me if you've heard some of it, but nobody's really going beyond that and saying, how do we fix it? They're all identifying the problem, but none of them have really come out yet and said how they would actually resolve those issues.
Yeah, and this is going to sound soft, but I think it's only humanly fair. I do quite feel for them over this because
But they have put themselves forward, right?
They have put themselves forward, but they weren't expecting it to happen quite now, probably. It's sooner than they thought, and some of them were actually trying to do government jobs before. And to say, come with a fully thought-through manifesto by now is quite tough. But nevertheless, I'm probably being too soft there. Basically, I agree with you, because we have heard one hell of a lot about certain issues, and we've heard, if we're honest, a lot about the internal workings of the Conservative Party. If I got 100 people on the top of a Birmingham bus today, they would actually say, well, what are you going to do about jobs, about housing, about transport, about net zero, and what are you going to do about the most important issue of all in this city, the functioning of our health service? And we have hardly heard those things talked about at all. So what I hope, and it's why actually, although I said earlier on you wouldn't wish this process on anybody, they've put themselves forward for it. What I really hoped was at this conference we'd begin to get to those bread and butter issues, and we would see which candidate had the capability of moving the party to at this stage it can't be detailed thought through, but where their position on these key issues were, and who we actually had confidence in as a leader to then get the detailed position over time. And thus far, I don't think that has happened. Some of the issues that are taking up a lot of airtime are not what citizens in this city are exercised by.
Do you think any of them have started to set out a position of how they would go about any of those issues?
How they would go about it, no. But I think they have begun to acknowledge the import in the reset, actually. Just once or twice we're hearing about the efficiency of public services coming in, but we're only really just scratching there. And what I'm still more interested in, though, if I could say, Ben, is there is a, without going down a policy provision in each area, there's a real question about where your centre of gravity is, what your overall strategy is. Is your overall strategy to try to take on reform and win back those votes and go hard right, or is your overall strategy, and of course it's one that I fervently believe while I was mayor, I was utterly loyal to this, that you're in the centre right, where I believe the huge majority of people are, and you actually position yourself there, and you're sufficiently confident that actually a lot of people who voted reform will come back to you if you lay out a really compelling strategic position there. A lot of people went to reform not because they agreed with Nigel Farage over detailed points, but they were just fed up with us and our inability to deliver. So you actually have to be confident in your new positioning.
Well, I think that's a really good point, because I think the premise of the question around should we lurch to try and ape reform or try and get reform voters back is the premise of the question is wrong, because a lot of them were already our voters. It's not
Correct.
as if they're a new section of voters
Correct.
that have appeared that we now have to appeal to. So are you not at risk of kind of saying, you know, there are genuine issues that people who voted reform do care about? I absolutely appreciate, and my view on this is that very few, if next to nobody, ever read the manifesto of reform and actually could tell you the detailed policies of reform. But there was definitely a genuine trend and sense around things like immigration, the economy. I think they tapped into the failure on the Conservative Party's part in other parts of the country, outside of the West Midlands and Teesside, I would say, around the failure of levelling up, etc. Are we not at risk of continuing to alienate people who voted reform by pretending as if they are some other, and that we shouldn't try and draw them back? Or are you having a more nuanced position?
I think it's far more nuanced than that. My argument is you will draw them back if you present real clear policy over time, but the policy does not have to be in exactly the same place as Nigel Farage, because actually it was almost with many, it's the classic protest. When people protest, they're moving against something, and so what we've got to do is be very confident to give them a magnet to come back to. But the big point, Ben, is slightly different. The big point is there are many more people that we lost to the Lib Dems and we lost to Labour, and if we are obsessed with the people who we did lose one way, we will forget that the middle ground is where the election will be won next time round. It always is. Look at the lesson of history. Stanley Baldwin, Margaret Thatcher, Edward Heath, David Cameron, all of these people won in the middle ground. And most importantly, Jeremy Corbyn lost because he went far left, and Keir Starmer won because he was firmly in the middle. The lesson of history could not be clearer.
I think it's interesting as well. I was speaking to a journalist actually last week who said earlier this week, and they were at Labour conference. And they were talking to people who said that they were knocking on doors in parts of the country where voters were deciding, and they couldn't decide between voting Lib Dem or Reform, which I think really reinforces your point that it's not this idea that we need to kind of lurch to the left to just attract, you know, Lib Dem seats that we now have in the south of England, or be worried about Reform to the right of us. It's almost, and I've heard you talk about this a bit, we almost have to have confidence and pride in our own offering and principles that will then create a centre of gravity that draws people
Correct.
back to us.
That's what you listened well.
I did
What
listen
had
well.
to say.
I did listen well.
I must have communicated reasonably effectively.
Well,
God
you are a
Christ
good
almighty.
communicator, Andy.
Yeah,
You are
okay,
a
yeah, yeah.
Have you? I'll ask it. I know you'll dodge the question, Andy. But have you backed anybody yet? Have you got anybody?
I
in
could
mind?
ask you the same question.
You could.
We are in exactly the same position.
But as the interviewer, I feel like I've got slightly more power to be able to press Andy.
And the reason I actually don't know if what I'm about to say is true. The reason I suspect neither of us have is it just becomes then a whole story of Andy's backed X. No, I don't want that to be the story. I want the story to be what we've just been talking about. Andy would like you to think about what type of leader we want, because the stakes are much greater. And that's when I came to this conference, I thought I'm going to take every opportunity to lay that out, not be attached to one person.
Well, I've heard this literally just this morning from some former MPs who are at conference, who are backing people not because they necessarily believe in the individual per se as the personification of the saviour of the Conservative Party, but they have a position that they feel like is going to get us back towards electability more effectively than maybe some others.
Yeah.
And I think that's a nuanced position that gets lost, particularly with kind of the mainstream media, that I think members take their role extremely seriously on this. And this idea that one or two of the candidates are kind of running out front because the members are just going to lurch as far to the right as possible, per se.
Yes.
I actually see, and having been in the Conservative Party, I don't know how long you've been in the Conservative Party, Andy. How long?
42 years.
Okay, you've been a little bit longer than I have. For as long as I've been in the Conservative Party, and I suspect you'll back this up, I've always believed the Conservative membership to be much more nuanced in its position in relation to it's the importance and the role it plays in selecting candidates as well as leadership contenders, and that it will be genuinely open to listen to all of the leadership contenders rather than this idea that whoever lurches to the right, the furthest to the right, is automatically going to win the membership.
I hope that is so. And the obvious example.
Do you think
that
is so, though? Or do you just
well, the
hope it?
piece of evidence is very clear with David Cameron, of course, in 2005. And conference then was the turning point for him. And I very much hope the same will be the case here.
Are there any candidates? Again, I'm trying to put you in a corner here, Andy, and you'll definitely get out of it.
Right,
but are there any candidates that you definitely don't want to become leader?
So let me take that question. I'm not going to say blogs, and
course.
you know I'm not,
Of course.
but you're trained to do this as well, so I will do it. I do think your question allows me to talk about something else we've not talked about thus far, and it's this question of personal leadership qualities. And I do think and you can have personal leadership qualities with a whole set of policies on one side or a whole set of policies on the other side. I'm trying to get here to the personality of leadership. And I do think that the electorate is very, very attuned to this because it feels let down. It feels that distrust, as we talked about earlier, and I suspect it's why the Labour Party is having a difficult time at the moment because this notion of double standards. So actually, what I think also needs to be revealed at this conference is who is genuinely authentic. With whom do you actually get what you see? Who is sufficiently confident in their own position to be themselves? All of those things. And authenticity is the word that sort of sums it up. And I do think what is being played out here is revealing some of the answers to those questions. That is all I'm going to say about that.
So if I ask you the direct question, do you think some of the leadership contenders, one or more, are being inauthentic?
Yes.
You think they are?
Yes.
Are? Okay. Well, we will leave the listeners and the people in the room to decide on who that might be. Moving slightly on from the general election and the leadership contest, I do want to reflect. We are in Birmingham. You were, until extremely recently, the Mayor of the West Midlands. And I, for one, I'm sure everybody in this room and people listening will echo this, that I think it is a huge, huge loss to the people of the West Midlands. Interestingly, we being mayors together for 7 years, people probably would be forgiven in thinking that we spent a lot of time together and we're on the phone to each other every other day, exchanging advice and ideas, which isn't true. Although we did speak, we do get on. It was interesting to see how close you got, particularly if we look in hindsight as to how devastating the general election was. And I'd just like, if you don't mind, giving us your reflections and analysis of how the mayoral election went in the West Midlands, obviously reflecting on how close you came and what you put it down to and how the campaign went. Just your reflections generally. It would be really
so you take
revealing.
Me back to the scene of the crime, but I've got to do it, so that's all right, Ben.
It's a bit of therapy.
Yeah, that's right. I've had enough of that in the last 5 minutes. Okay, I think the best way of describing how the campaign went is that the date is printed on my mind, the 19th of December. I went to get the research we'd commissioned from a good polling company. We never did research apart from this once before each of the campaigns. And each time it was very valuable, actually. And they basically said, and I expected to get my P45, actually. I thought it was December. I thought, I'm going to be told I can't win this election. Let's not bother. We'll save a bit of money and I'll have 4 months off. But actually, that's not what they said. They said, if you fight this campaign as a straight ConLab campaign, you will lose massively. And the Conservative Party lost across the West Midlands in the general election to Labour by about 180,000, I think the numbers were. I may have that number wrong. At least 150. Anyway, but they also said, if you fight it as Andy's the Mayor of the West Midlands, what I rather pompously sometimes called Brand Andy, with the support of all the wonderful Conservative teams across the West Midlands, let's be clear, one of our great strengths was the way we were all glued together, so I wasn't in any way denying that. But actually, you may just inch it. So I thought, right, that's what we're going to do. And we did. And the interesting thing was the Labour Party had exactly the same research, I'm sure. And they therefore fought their campaign on the whole thing of Labour, Labour, Labour. They didn't really use the name of their candidate particularly much. It was just brand Labour.
You saw the exact same thing in Teesside
almost
as well.
the same thing. And they saw it as a plebiscite for the Labour Party, basically. And they ran the campaign from London, really. There were London people who came here to run it, and they saw it as mission critical in the run-up to the general election. You know, the story was very simple. If they couldn't win in Teesside, they couldn't win in the West Midlands. That was a problem to them. Ben did brilliantly and thwarted them. I sadly fell short. But it was so important to the Labour Party. They ran it in that way. So there were almost two campaigns with two completely different strategies that almost never met. It was logical on both sides. We came so close, but it wasn't quite good enough. And if you ask me why it wasn't quite good enough, one thing, we won a lot of Lib Dem votes. We squeezed them just to 2% of the vote here. We did well to squeeze Reform. They just got 5% in the general election following, I think their number here was heading towards 20. And the swing against me was only 4%, and that was very little. But the thing that thwarted us was in our best areas, too many Conservative voters just stayed at home. And they just said, I just can't bring myself to vote for the Conservative brand at the moment. So we had a very clear strategy. We executed it. Actually executed it successfully when you look at the numbers. But it wasn't quite sufficient against the background.
It's absolutely fascinating because obviously at the same time I was fighting my election, so we left each other alone, and I wasn't really paying attention to what was going on in your area. But everything you've just said, I could tell you exactly the same in the Teesside Tees Valley election. They didn't put the name of the candidate on the leaflets or any of their campaign material. They didn't talk about any local issues. They were trying to frame it as a kind of a national Conservative, reject the national Conservative, because they knew, I think, in the Tees Valley, but absolutely in the West Midlands, that your record, they had to try and ignore and kind of mix and smear in with the national campaign to try and move it away from the local to the national. One of the things that I got, and I don't know whether you did this or not, but I got the complaint that, well, I didn't put Conservative, it's not true, but I didn't put the name Conservative on any of my leaflets, or all of my leaflets were blue as well. Were yours all blue? Did you put Conservative on your leaflets? Or as part of that polling, did you try and completely kind of distinct yourself as a mayoral candidate?
I mean, there's lots of people in the room from the West Midlands. I can see them all. So I hope what I now say is fair. The leaflets were green, but crucially, the leaflets were green in 2017. They did have Conservative on them, of course, and the very reason that they were green was we were trying to get a critical message across. I was not the Conservative Party's candidate in the West Midlands sent by London. I was Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands, who happened to be a very proud Conservative, would work with the Conservatives locally, but would represent this place to the then was Conservative government. And when we were establishing the mayoralty here, it was a critical point to win. It was also, by the way, a critical point to win with the various prime ministers I've dealt with.
Absolutely.
That on occasions your loyalty is to your region, not to your government. So it was all part of the same message to send. Establishing a new political office. It's different to being an MP where you are whipped by the party. Neither of us were whipped by our party. We were elected to do something different.
Which I think was pretty evident in some of the things that we both did, which we might come on to. But it was, again, really interesting. So I got blamed at this election when I was elected. I stood up on the stage for the announcement, and afterwards, all of the press, one of the questions I got asked by everybody is, why didn't you wear a blue rosette? Were you trying to distance yourself from the Conservative Party? None of them then said, well, hang on, I didn't wear a rosette in 2017 or 2021 either, just because I don't wear rosettes. But they were trying, and again, I saw this with the interviews you did afterwards, because your result was the day after mine, so I was following your result, obviously, very, very closely. And it was this idea that the media were trying to push this narrative, which again is a false dichotomy, that we were trying to pretend that we weren't Conservatives. And it wasn't that. It was, we are Conservatives, but that as a regional election, as in effect the titular leader of the region in a mayoralty, there is a nuance to how you fight that campaign compared to a general election campaign and an MP. And again, I don't want to rub salt in the wounds, Andy, but I did hear something that it was 1,200 votes that you lost by, which was in effect one vote in every polling station across the region, which just demonstrates how close it was on an electorate of...
So the electorate was 2 million. Wow. I lost by 1,500, actually, if only been 1,200, which was one vote in every polling station, or put in parliamentary language, it's a majority of 28 in each of our 28 parliamentary constituencies, so it could not have been closer. And of course, the inevitable thing, if something's very close, you keep going back to what could have been. Oh, if, Blogs had done that on that day, it might just have been different if I'd done it. But I'll just give you one other stat, which for, I think, my team in the Mayoral team, just to again talk about how effective the campaign was, even though we lost. We got 224,000 votes. The total Conservative vote at the general election with a double turnout was 226,000. So it tells you didn't leave much on the table at the mayoral election, actually. So I come out of it thinking it was bloody difficult. I'm bloody proud of what we did for 7 years. Indeed, arguably, and you would say the same, Ben, arguably the surprise is that we won in the first place, because this is the youngest, most diverse, most urban place in Britain. You would not, if you'd been sticking pins in maps in 2017, you would not say the West Midlands is going to be what the media then ended up describing as a stronghold of conservatism. So there's something good in the story about how we achieved that.
Absolutely. And again, I don't want to kind of go over the what if, but given that it was 1,500 votes in an electorate of approximately 2 million people, is it fair to then say if Reform hadn't have stood a candidate, even though they only got such a small percentage of the vote, that we would have won? Or do you?
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah.
Of course it is. Yeah.
But I suppose you would make the same argument if the Lib Dems didn't stand. You probably would.
Yeah. And there was an independent who took votes from Labour, so it's slightly more complicated.
So again, not to go into too much detail because we get into a little bit too much nuance, but that was a really interesting story that then led into the general election in the West Midlands, actually, about this kind of independent candidate that was from the Muslim community.
Yes.
How did that play out in the election? Because again, you would argue, I think some people in the analysis afterwards were talking about, okay, you only lost by 1,500 votes, but in reality, had the independent candidate that was picking at the scab of the Labour Party's position on Gaza and Palestine, actually you would have lost by substantially more. Again, do you think there's a direct read across into that could inform potentially future Labour Party policy, or actually would that vote have come towards you as well? No.
Let's just be. We could get wrapped in too much detail here.
Absolutely, but it's just.
It is definitely true that had Reform not stood, we'd have been in a better place. And by the way, Mark, this I think is an important national point. When I lost, Richard Tice went on the television and said, Reform have cost Andy Street the mayoralty in the West Midlands, and quote unquote, we are pleased about it. So do not misunderstand their purpose. They wanted me to lose. Because it played their thing. So let's just nail that one down first of all. They have to be defeated. Now, the Gaza candidate, it did suppress the Labour vote, but it's not as simple as all those people who were motivated to vote for him would have gone and voted Labour before. I think they turned out a lot of people who perhaps stood by before. Okay. But there is something far more important than what happened in my mayoral election about that. This is, they're very entitled to their view over Gaza, and of course today of all days, we must feel incredible distress over it. But I do not consider it a positive development in politics. In this city, we now have an independent MP. There could have easily been 4 of them in this city, actually. Labour only hung on in 3 other constituencies very, very narrowly. Obviously, where Streeting almost lost, and there are MPs of this nature, I think, in Lancashire and in Leicester and Yorkshire. This is not a good development, because for as long as we can remember, our politics have been completely secular. And this is the first time that faith-based politics have come in. Now, faith and Gaza, they're 2 different things, obviously, but there's a huge overlap. And I don't consider it a positive development at all.
Last thing on the campaign, and I really appreciate how candid you've been about it, Andy, because, again, I couldn't imagine being in your shoes. With the amount of work you've put in, trying to put myself into your shoes, having lost so narrowly, I would be much more sour than you currently are, so thank you for that. One of the things that happened, we are in Birmingham, but last year we went to Manchester.
Oh, God.
You were talked about a lot last year, and it seemed last year it was really odd because I was kind of doing my thing, but it seemed all anybody wanted to talk about was HS2 because the government had kind of walked into a conference without clarifying the position on HS2 and allowed it to overshadow kind of 4 days of a conference where all the media and everybody was talking about was what's happening with HS2. And one of the stories out of that was, well, we have Andy Street, Mayor of the West Midlands, huge supporter of HS2, and you were quite keen, or tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm not putting words in your mouth, but it seemed to me like you were quite keen to lean into that. And obviously I remember very famously the press conference outside of the Midland where you were very, very strongly sending a signal to the government. Tell me a little bit about that, but also in the context of, do you think in hindsight, did that help you or hinder you both from a national policy point of view on HS2, but also your position in standing up to the government. Did that just emphasise that the fact that you were a Tory and the Tory government were taking away HS2, or did that actually help you win votes by being distinct from the party and standing up for the West Midlands and HS2?
So there's three different stories to draw out of this, which are some good, some bad. But the first thing to say, Ben, is I did not go to Manchester choosing to have a row over HS2. The government chose that they were going to use Manchester to cancel the northern leg of HS2, and you can all make your judgment as to the sense of doing that. So I found myself in a position that I did not want, and if I'm very honest, I did not expect they would be so stupid as to do it. I've given my view on it now. The 3 points are, number one, on occasions, doing this job, it goes back to what you say earlier on. You have to stand up for your region against your party. And the press conference that you referred to was outside the Prime Minister's Hotel, the Midland Hotel. It led the 10 o'clock news. It was exactly a year ago, as you say, last night, actually. And I don't regret doing it, because on occasions you actually have to say, no, I'm not prepared to be treated like this. And people here expected me to stand up for the place. By the way, before anyone misinterprets it, that is not saying that HS2 had been properly prosecuted. It had not been. It was a runaway train, and there's so much to be learned about that. But the decision the Prime Minister was taking to cut the objective of it was wrong, and I needed to stand up to it. It did me huge good here. Second point then, did it do me good or bad? It did me huge good here in people seeing that I was independent-minded and be prepared to do that. I will never know what harm it did me with relationship with the government over long term, and how things that might have happened possibly didn't happen. All I would say is that someone who definitely had the capacity to move on and forget that. Now, two people who need to be called out incredibly positively, both Jeremy Hunt and Michael Gove, were very, very charming about it, understood why I had to do what I did, and they and I worked incredibly effective to the dying days of my mayoralty. So they had no long-term issue over it at all. And then the third issue is the really positive one. Obviously, the Prime Minister took his decision. I think I protected Euston, and I think I protected the link to Handsacre, because when he first told me about it, it was going to be from Old Oak Common to Curzon Street. So we did improve it in that negotiation. But most importantly, the work that Andy Burnham and I kicked off to find an alternative to HS2 to link Birmingham and Manchester, because anyone who's been on a train between the two or sat on the M6 knows the links are not good enough. It's not good enough for a modern competitive economy. We have now presented the work to government. It shows there is an alternative at lower cost, and actually a good thing will come out of that, because it's brought the private sector in, and hopefully it will move the new government to a position where they don't have to approach big infrastructure projects in the same way as our government rather poorly approached HS2.
Do you think when you stood up to the government outside of the Midland, like you said, led the 10 o'clock news, huge thing at the time, actually not just at conference, but I think it kind of bled out post-conference as well and had a huge impact. Do you think you should have resigned? You know, when you threatened to resign, or did you? Let me clarify that. Did you threaten to resign? Because there were lots of rumours saying if this happens, Andy Street is going to resign. Is that something you said? Did you leak that? Did you kind of plant that rumour? What was all
No,
about?
I tell you who said it, and anyone who watches the film of that press conference will see it. The marvellous Beth Rigby with a bright pink lipstick. She was saying, he's going to resign, he's going to resign. Where did you get that from? And this became the story. So Beth was the originator of that, not me. Should I have resigned? No, because all I would have done is pass this region to the Labour Party. That was blindingly obvious at the time. Yeah.
And that's a fair point. So, I mean, Beth is responsible for lots of rumours flying around, particularly around the Conservative Party in general. On HS2, I mean, just a couple of minutes on this, because I want to get on to a little bit about what it is actually to be a mayor, and in particular taking your business hat into it and how you kind of see the role of being in business, a mayor, and also potentially into national politics in a Westminster style. Well, HS2, I mean, I'll put on record, you and I are on opposite sides of the divide on this. And I took the view, and again, Teesside was the beneficiary of this, and may not be, because it looks like the Labour government are going to rip all of this up, but after the announcement of HS2 being cancelled, the government then said, well, the money that we would have spent on HS2, we're going to reallocate as part of Network North, which are the various projects across the north of England. By and large, there was some elsewhere in the country as well, but by and large, that money was going to be redistributed across the north. And then as mayors, for example, me in the Tees Valley, we got allocated £1 billion of transport monies that we wouldn't otherwise have had it not been for the cancellation of HS2. Now, I say that because things have changed and moved on, because it looks like, well, we now know formally that the Labour government are reviewing that, And it looks like that money, I suspect, is probably going to be pulled, because I think what they're going to say is that money was never real, it was never actually there, even though it is, because we've kind of gone through planning and started spending some of it in advance. How do you, and again, this is slightly taking your kind of West Midlands, Mayoral, Birmingham cheerleader hat off. Is HS2 not just a massive waste of money? And would we better not be spending that money in regions that haven't seen infrastructure development, the likes of which Birmingham and Manchester have had for many, many years, compared to places like Middlesbrough or Newcastle elsewhere? Is it not fair that we should see areas that have been left behind for many decades outside of our big metropolitan centres getting their fair share rather than spending more money on white elephants?
It's only become a white elephant, Ben.
It was a bit of a prod. That's all I'm doing.
And you see, that you see, that's cheeky.
It is. Sorry, I
because
apologise.
That is the whole point. It risks becoming a white elephant if it is a fast train from Old Oak Common to Curzon Street.
But was it not already?
No. Had it been a replacement for the West Coast Main Line, which is completely over-congested, a replacement for freight on the M6, which, as we all know, is over-congested, it would have been what our Victorian forefathers did, be the spine of connectivity for the country for the next 100 years, been a node for growth at all the stations along it. The original idea and vision and business case was right, and there was a good financial case. The problem is, costs were not controlled for all sorts of reasons, partly because of MPs did too much lobbying, and we've steadily whittled away the objective so that now, to be very honest, there is not a business case now, hence why you can use the word white elephant. And what I was saying last year is we've got to hold on to this vision, actually. To answer your question head on, though, can't be an either or, because, of course, Teesside's got to have its investment to improve it, but I don't think even the fiercest resident of Teesside will say that investment there actually deals with the whole north-south connectivity. They were two different things. And really the challenge to this country has been you have got to find a way that you can make the big infrastructure leaps. Let's look at Heathrow. Was world's busiest airport once, dwindling away, losing competitively because we haven't been able to find a solution to it. How long did we procrastinate over the Channel Tunnel? People now don't say that was the wrong thing to do. We have to have the big investments, the game-changing investments, as well as what you've talked about.
And so, just quickly, help people, because I've seen some very high level, and some people in here will have seen it. This joint piece of work that you and Andy Burnham have done around, in effect, leveraging private investment in HS2. I saw some numbers, and again, I'll play devil's advocate here. I saw some numbers about you could deliver HS2 at 60% of the cost. Is that realistic? Is there a realistic plan there?
You've asked the wrong question, and let me just explain. Only being
it's fine. It's not the first time I've been accused of that. I'm new to this,
You're doing all right for a beginner, so that's all right. Let's be clear. The government cancelled HS2 North last year. The work that Andy Burnham and I were doing was not to say, how do we protect HS2? It was to say, with the benefit of the best private sector companies in the world, and we had a little celebration event last night to say you've done a good job on this, but literally brought in the best companies led by Arup, and full marks to them. They were prepared to put their head above the parapet when the Prime Minister was saying no, 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 and brought the coalition of the private sector companies in. And it was to say, how do we address the objective of HS2, even if it is not going to happen? And the objective is better connectivity between the second and third regions of the country, and you can work out which order they sit in. What they have come back and said, and the work has now been presented, is you can get the huge majority of the benefits for about 60% of the cost. They've done that work pro bono, by the way, but it is not by having exactly the same as HS2. Right. And the big give, if I'm honest, is not to have it quite as fast. Because
this was always the misnomer with HS2.
Was.
And it goes to the point that you just raised, because, again, speaking to people in government many years ago with the HS2, the comms on HS2 were wrong. It's called high-speed rail, and the point that you just made, it was never actually about that. It was about capacity constraints. Extra, whatever it is, 15, 20 minutes is fine. But it wasn't about the speed, was it? It was about the inhibitors to rail and freight in the UK.
And how you use that to grow the economy. Yeah. And you only have to look at, let's just give you another example, make you just think about this. Look how East London has been developed by its infrastructure investment there. And it's so obvious that rail infrastructure has driven all that. Look how it's happened in the TGV network in France. But that's the goal. So this private sector work is how do you do the goal without the costs and the mismanagement of HS2.
Brilliant. Thank you, Andy. Just moving on, being mayor, like I said, I kind of touched upon this earlier, you've worn lots of different hats in your long and illustrious career. You started out in business, Chief Exec, obviously, of John Lewis. Did incredibly well with John Lewis. You might have some comments about how John Lewis is doing at the minute.
No.
Feel free to announce them here, your personal views on John Lewis. Then the mayoral...
I'll tell you one thing about that.
Go on, please do.
You can't buy shares in John Lewis because it's an employee-owned business. But if you could, you should go and buy them now, because they've newly appointed a new chair who is CEO of Tesco UK for 30 years, and they've employed a new chief executive of John Lewis who... Well, I'm biased. He used to work with me, but
a protege.
But he has been CEO of a department store group in Canada for the last 10 years, and they are going back to their retail roots. They will bounce back.
Oh, that's interesting. That's not even insider information.
It's
like
not.
You say, we
it's
can't
in the
buy
public
shares
domain.
Anyway, so
but you can. The worst thing about running John Lewis was that it was like a national institution. Everybody had a view on it. You know, if we changed. It was
the Christmas advert.
It was, but everyone had a view on it. So you will all work out the significance of what I say, that they're going back to their roots with the retailer in both of the key jobs.
I will judge the success of John Lewis as to whether they get back to having the best Christmas adverts again. Because
we'll see.
They've definitely gone downhill.
We'll see.
Gone downhill.
Yeah.
So, but just going back to the point, so you've been in business. The mayoral role is obviously very different to that, and it'd be interesting. Let's start off with that: the difference between being in business and the mayoral role itself, and the element of politics in the mayoral role, which we've already discussed, is distinct from national politics.
Yeah. So the first thing to say is there's not as much difference as you might think. It's strange. Very, very few people in Britain have gone from business to real success in politics. But actually, for me, it's possibly because of the mayoral role. This is the sort of nuance to draw out of this. I had for years in business, I'd always been interested in politics, but for years I'd said, no, I don't want to be an MP. Never got into it. But when the mayoral role in the West Midlands came, I thought, that's the one that I want. That's the one that my background prepares you for, because there's a hell of a lot of commonality. Most importantly, the CEO is the front man of John Lewis. If it all went wrong, I was on the telly explaining it. The mayor is the front man, the cheerleader, you might almost say, the ambassador for the West Midlands. And you do, you get round the world banging the drum for it. So that front man is the same. The second thing is, actually, you've got to set your strategy. And this, of course, is very different to an MP's role. And I'm not disparaging an MP's role. They're just totally different. You are, in a sense, the chief executive of the West Midlands, the chief executive of Teesside. And you have to say what you are going to do. You then appoint the people to bloody well deliver it. And you hold them account to deliver it. And if they're not up to it, you move them on. You make sure you've got your budget sorted out to do it. And then you sort of monitor your progress towards it. And I became obsessed with the data for the West Midlands, just as you become obsessed with the data as a CEO. So actually the skills that are needed to do the two jobs are very, very similar. That is not the same as all political jobs. And it's sort of where Michael Heseltine was when he talked about these mayoral roles being different political jobs all those years ago. And he hoped they would attract a different type of person into them. And I hope in Ben and I that has actually happened. There is, if I'm very honest, and this is no comment on the individuals at all, but if you look across all the other mayors who are all Labour mayors, it has not attracted the breadth of people that I hoped it would. They're good individuals, but they're all schooled in politics, so it hasn't brought that breadth in. There is a big difference, though, as well, just to finish off the answer to the question, because I've talked about the sort of how you go about the job. The big difference is, of course, and this is perhaps what I was less good at, the big difference is in business, most people are basically on side with you, and if you get your team right and your strategy right, people will follow. It is hugely different, where half of the people are trying to bowl you out in politics, and that was I did find that part of it, the opposition for opposition's sake, utterly frustrating. Yeah,
we do. And again, looking from afar in Teesside, it felt to me, and we've never discussed this before, but it felt to me in strategic terms, and again, we'll get into the detail of this, it felt like we had broadly the same plan. So my plan in the Tees Valley was, it was an economy that was broken, massive underinvestment, relatively high levels of unemployment, low wage growth or no wage growth at all, insecure work, service sector, slightly different challenges, but the strategy behind it was attract big investment, go for foreign direct investment, let's grow businesses, let's create the investment and the jobs, and then from that it'll put more money in people's pockets, it'll start to create momentum that then builds more investment. Businesses like good news, they like places on the move, so you then, one investment attracts another investment and it gets a self-fulfilling prophecy. And obviously I very much focused, given the assets that we had available to us, we obviously had the former Edgar Steelworks, massive, biggest industrial investment in Western Europe, certainly from a scale point of view. We obviously had the thing that I will be forever linked to, which is Teesside Airport, which helped me be able to deliver some of these big things. It felt to me like, looking from afar, you had the same strategy, but implemented it in a very unique West Midlands way. Would you agree with the idea that we had a similar strategy? And I'd also be interested to know how you implemented it, which was obviously in a very different way to the way that I've been implementing it in Teesside.
The one-word answer is yes. So let's just flesh that out a bit. It's odd enough, it almost goes back to what I said about what the role was. So what you've just described was, as the chief executive of Teesside, setting your strategy and then following it through, just as the CEO does. It's a perfect example of what I was talking about of the mayoral role. Our position was subtly different within that broad agreement, because you had one or two really iconic places which talked about the re-emergence of Teesside. I would not be able to say that was the thing in quite the same way. And frankly, the space you had was a luxury we certainly did not have in our industrial
well, you
estate.
had Coventry Airport, I see you were trying to flog all over the place.
That is certainly true, but it's not on the scale. If you look at the scale, you had something incredible.
Yeah, that's true.
So there were one or two really iconic things for you. I think, though, there's three similarities I want to call out. You do definitely need talkability points, if that makes sense. And the mayor's job is to find them and then really promote them, because you are the front man, you're the cheerleader. And so for us, it was completely different. But the Commonwealth Games was an incredible opportunity, and the whole thing, from bidding for it to the legacy, has lasted right through my 7 years term, including the wonderful centrepiece 2 years ago now.
Do you think that was worth having then?
It was. There is absolutely no question it was worth having, in terms of the pride it brought to this place, the media attention it brought to this place, the investment that it brought, actually.
Did it stack up in the data?
It did stack up in the numbers as well, and that's not just my view. DCMS did a very hard-nosed assessment of it, and it definitely paid off, actually.
So why is it then, since the Commonwealth Games has struggled to find a home, and there was talk about potentially even bringing it back to Birmingham, wasn't there? So
there was. We were asked, and I was very clear we shouldn't do it because it needs to be peripatetic, and we'd never have recreated what we did that once.
Okay.
But anyway, but was it what the point of the story is, and it is definitely right, there was a sort of talkability there, almost like your airport, actually. And it gave people pride. We're doing this. Welcome the world. The second huge similarity is the winning private sector investment. And people in these jobs get obsessed with the politics of it. But I was absolutely clear. I had to be alongside the business community winning investment. And we have been incredibly successful in that. So the latest data says this city, let alone the West Midlands, has had the best performance of any city outside London ever. And that is literally, it is true. And that doesn't come about by magic. We put the infrastructure in place. I went round the world and banged the drum, whether it be in Brisbane or whether it be in Toronto or New York or anywhere in India.
How did you target that? So, because this is the thing, people say, you go out and just attract investment.
No.
It's more nuanced than that,
more, we keep using that word nuance, but it's back to the strategic plan.
Yeah.
So we chose, and I suspect you did something very similar. We knew the sectors that we were brilliant in, and frankly, we were not so good on some other things. There's no point us going to India and talking about chemical manufacture. Not a lot of it happens here. But every point in us going to India and talk about IT outsourcing, or whether it be going to talk about EV manufacture. So you choose the sectors in your plan, and then everything aligns behind them.
And for those
the inward investment, skills,
Sorry, Andy, but for those here, but also people listening, what did you identify as those key sectors for the West Midlands?
Yeah, so we did what we called our plan for growth. We called it. It was proper a study of what are we strong in, first of all, and what do we have the potential to grow in areas which are growing fast. So advanced manufacturing is, of course, the critical thing for us, and particularly in that there were subsectors like aerospace and also electric vehicles. Then, of course, there was a whole thing about financial services, and the digitisation of financial services really important. Logistics, obviously very clear. Creative was a very big one for us as well. So a number of areas where we had clear advantages and could grow them. And then all of our effort was put on that. And then the last part of the similarity was building the infrastructure in the widest sense to support all of that. Now, people immediately think about trams and everything that we have. And yes, we have now increased our investment in transport 10 times over. But it's also the digital infrastructure, it's the housing infrastructure, it's the education infrastructure, all those other things that have a lot less talk about, but they build the economy from the bottom up.
That's really interesting, because just as we kind of come towards the end, it gets me onto the really last topic, which is the future of devolution and your reflections, particularly under the new government, because you're absolutely right. And what we're seeing from this government is, I think, a more centralised control of what devolution is. So my interpretation, having dealt with the government for the last couple of months, is they talk, I mean, the rhetoric is fantastic. Let's give them the due. Actually, what they're saying, if they deliver it, would be fantastic for devolution. Getting rid of all of the strings attached from the monies, and this is interesting because you've got the Trailblazer deals in the West Midlands that you negotiated, but from my point of view, which we're not as fortunate as the West Midlands at the minute in that sense, getting rid of all the strings attached to the funding that mayors have access to, so that we have complete control of the finance to be able to implement what we know is best for our local area, including all of that supporting infrastructure, which isn't just hard infrastructure, it's the skills, it's the people, it's the workforce, etc., etc., etc. So the rhetoric's great, but then what the government seem to be doing is overlaying it with the national industrial strategy and local industrial strategies and saying, we are going to help you pick what your priorities are going to be, and then we will allow you to spend this money on your priorities, but nothing else. You're obviously still paying attention to this, Andy. Are you getting a sense of that? What do you think the positives out of this government could be, or what direction do you think they're going?
So, Ben, you have to live this day by day. I fortunately don't have to worry about this now. So,
but you also thought about this during the Trailblazer stuff as well.
Oh, Christ!
The same issues with the civil service and the process.
So let's be clear. The Conservative governments. Right back to David Cameron in 2010, can be incredibly proud over what they've done here. It was a bit stop-start, the process of devolution or levelling up, but at the end of it, with the Trailblazer deals, and again, I'll name the same two people, Michael Gove and Jeremy Hunt, absolutely said, we trust local people, we are giving you a hell of a lot of money, and I'll just come back to the sums in a minute, and we're going to give you the powers to decide yourself how you spend that money. That is a mature adult relationship, and that was what was negotiated and what was the specific point that was agreed for Greater Manchester and the West Midlands. It was always intended by the Conservative government. It would then extend to other places afterwards, so it would even have come to Teesside, I'm sure, was that at the next spending review, we'd be given one sum of money, just like Scotland and Wales, and we would decide locally how we spent it between the different priorities. That is a mature relationship. And whatever else is said about my mayoralty, I am very proud that the confidence government had in the West Midlands got them to that point. My great regret is obviously I'm not there to see the fruits of that, because there was a lot of fruit. We handed to the incoming Labour mayor in this region a capital pot of £6 billion. That is a lot of money when we had not a penny 7 years ago. And an annual budget for the CA of £1.5 billion. So my great regret was that somebody else was now going to be able to spend all that capital that we'd worked hard making the cases to government. Now,
well, he said all of that's under review, though, the new mayor.
Well, this is the whole point. This is where you know a lot more than I do, Ben, what now appears to be the case is there is a lot less confidence that money is going to come through. So I'm absolutely, without looking at the detail, knowing the detail, I absolutely agree with what you've said, Ben. They are talking a good game on it, but the real acid test is, do they stand behind the financial arrangements that the Conservative government put in place? Because I can look everyone in the eye and say, if you don't have the money and they don't have the powers, the job is incredibly difficult. And where we made most progress was where those two things were really clear, and we were doing a really good job with the Conservative government and moving that forward.
Well, it would be absolutely travesty if that changes, Andy, because the legacy that you put in place with the work that you did in 7 years, one of the things that people don't see behind the scenes, actually creating the mayoralities with them being brand new, the structures of them. I think you've been an absolutely shining light for the West Midlands, but actually for the Conservative Party more generally, Andy, and hopefully this is not the end of your journey. So on that point, just to wrap up, one of the things that really struck me about the mayoral election, and obviously the defeat that you suffered sadly, was the interview you did with Sophie Ridge immediately afterwards, which, I mean, I can put myself to some extent in your shoes, given that we're in the same role, and I could have easily have suffered the same fate as you if circumstances had been slightly different. And I thought you did incredibly well in responding to that. And obviously one of the questions that then came immediately out after that is, Andy Street going to play an extremely important role in the future of the Conservative Party. They were trying to lay blame. They were trying to get you to lay blame at somebody's feet, which we don't need to go into.
Didn't do it. Yeah.
But did you consider standing in the general election? Because we knew, irrespective of whether it was going to be when he called it, which nobody knew at the time, because nobody understood. Still don't understand why he did it. But it was likely to be October, November, December time. It must have been in your mind as to whether you would consider standing in the general election or not. Was it?
So let me just say something about that interview first, because I do think it's a very important point here that's relevant to the leadership contest and what you've asked me earlier on. Obviously, that day was pretty devastating. You've worked for 7 years to achieve something. We thought we were going to win. CCHQ even released stories in the morning that we weren't going to win, bloody hell. And we didn't. But I said to myself during that day, whatever happens, I will do the right thing tonight. Lots of advisors were saying to me, don't even talk to the media. No, I'd known these people for a long time. Sophie's a journalist I've really come to like and respect. I hope she'd say the same about me. So it was her I wanted to talk to first, as well as the local people. And all I look back on is it was a tough day, but I came out of it with my integrity intact.
Absolutely.
And nobody can ask more than that after 7 years of leading a region for what we...
I also think it's a key sign of leadership, actually. It's one of the things that I took from your interview was owning it, not blaming anybody else, keeping your integrity, and I think that is a style of leadership that all of the leadership contenders could learn
That's
from.
the sort of point. And
the you obviously can't say that for yourself. But
and the public see through it.
They do.
You don't do that.
That's
the point.
So were you going to stand in the general election? Did you consider it?
Yes. So the question came rather sooner than I thought. I thought I'd have a few months to think about it as what I was going to do. And without putting too fine a point on it, there was a vacancy in Solihull, which is where I grew up. We did win Solihull. We got a brilliant new MP for Solihull, a moderate, sensible man. So a number of people tried to persuade me. All sorts of people actually in the party rang me up and said, you must do it. But in the end, I decided not. And the answer lies in what we've talked about before. I talked about the nature of this job. It was an executive job. It was a frontman job. Being an MP is a different job, and I have huge respect for them. They do an incredibly important thing, but it was not going to play to my strengths. So I just said, that is not for me.
Would you stand in the future?
Well, I think the underlying things are still. Never say never, Ben, but to be quite straight with you, there is utterly no plan at all. And I think maybe that was the moment where it could have happened. So there's no plan. But there's also something about being honest. The reason I was able to do this job well, I was fairly fearless in pursuing my own views. You have to be whipped as an MP. You have to do the party loyalty stuff. I wasn't actually sure I'd be very good at doing it.
I don't think you would be, to be fair, Andy.
Particularly, dare I say it, with some of the characters who may be leader. And I did work through all that in my head. And so I'm pleased with the decision I've made.
Two very quick questions to round off then. One's a slightly salacious question, and I'm sure you probably won't answer it. But I heard a rumour that in relation, was it Solihull West, that you were considering
yes, Solihull
it?
West.
So we know that that's to be true because you were, people were asking you and you were clearly considering
Yes,
it.
I was.
I'd heard a rumour that you did want to go for Solihull West and you were going to go for it, but that number 10 blocked you from going for it because of what you did over HS2. Is there any truth in that?
I do not know if that is true. I took my own decision. I do not know what number 10's position was.
Fair enough, I won't push it any further. And very quickly...
The very fact it's a rumour, though, Ben, and you asked me the question in good faith, I mean, it's an unbelievable situation, isn't it? You can work for 7 years, represent your party, which became unpopular, and be the figurehead of it in the West Midlands, and then that question comes. I find it quite staggering, actually.
Well, hopefully it isn't the end for you in politics, Andy. We would, as a party in the country, would be poorer for it if you did leave politics behind. But what is next? What's next for Andy?
I don't know. I've had a good holiday. I've had the first summer off since 1985 because I very stupidly finished John Lewis on a Friday and started my campaign to be West Midlands Mayor on a Monday. So I haven't had any proper time off. So I thought, right, I'm going to make the most of it. So I had a good holiday. I've done lots of things I wouldn't otherwise have done this summer.
That's what you've done. What are you doing next, Andy?
No. It's the right pushback. But I'm saying that because I don't know. Because there is no. Everyone said to me, you get all sorts of job offers, but it's not come to pass. So I wait to see. Be patient.
Well, I'm sure whatever it is, it's going to be great, Andy, and I look forward to seeing what happens next. Like I say, it would be great to see you have a significant role in the Conservative Party going forward. I want to just say thank you very much for your time.
And can I say something to you, which is you are the surviving Conservative Mayor, Ben, so very good luck to you, because it's very, very important to this party that we continue to carry the flag for devolution, and Ben is obviously the flag bearer, so good luck to you.
That's very kind, Andy. So, thank you very much for coming. This has been the first live streamed episode of the Blueprint Podcast, brought to you by Conservative Home, the incredible Conservative Home. If you're interested in listening to this back, or you have friends who you might think actually they would have been really interested in listening to this, you can catch this on the Conservative Home website. You can download the podcast on all of the usual podcast platforms, or you can watch it on YouTube. So watch out for the next episode. Thank you very much, Andy Street, and we'll see everybody again. Thank you.
Thank you. Good.